Right, for the sake of timing, because I know that George has got to get away at a decent time today, we'll kick off. Right, so firstly, the people that don't know me and haven't met me, my name is Gary Pine. I've been an IIM board member now for the best part of the last 12 months. And having joined the board, I had an idea that we could make the IIM much more than it is. And in terms of what I meant by that is the current kind of nature of work is changing. And as George will talk about in a second, AI predominates and kind of drives a lot of what we do in terms of planning and how we execute our day-to-day jobs. But I tried, where possible, to pull in interested speakers, and guess what? George was top of my list. And I want to challenge the status quo. I want to get people in to talk to the IIM membership and anybody that wants to come along and have a listen. Topics that interest me, topics that I don't know about particularly well myself, and take for granted. And having worked with George on a number of different projects in the past, once again, he jumped up to the top of my thinking and went, I wonder. And when we talked about potential topics, the combination of going down the rabbit hole and the application of AI as it relates to market research, I thought, what a fantastic topic to kick this thing off. So without much further ado, I'm going to hand across to George. What we'll do is, if there's any questions, drop them in the chat. We'll pick up with George afterwards. But as I said, George has got to get away a little bit before 1 o'clock. So if I talk a little bit quicker than I normally do at the end, you'll see that George is probably doing that in the background to wind me up and speed me on. Right, George, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Good to see you. Thanks for giving away your lunch to come and listen to me drone on about drowning in data and starved of insight. So, over the next few slides, and there aren't that many, I'm going to try and make the case, if you will, for a different type of research that I think may well help you in some of the various roles that you do. So with no further ado, says he, pressing a button. Here's the next slide. So what I'm going to talk about today is field research, and I will explain a wee bit more about what that actually looks like a bit later on. But field research, unsurprisingly, rather than traditional lab-based research when you're in the lab or in your chair or at your desk, field research is really boots on the ground when you're out there, talking to the customers, talking to the stakeholders that you serve and those whom you work for or with. So what I'm going to ask, the question I'm going to try and answer is that, can that approach, can the boots on the ground field research save us? Because I do think, as Gary's alluded to, we are in danger of getting ourselves completely twisted up and drowning in too much data and quite a lot of AI. You can see on the slide there, I have put in brackets. This is not a downer on quant research, and it's not a downer on AI per se. But I do wonder whether or not we've become a bit too swayed by the hype of AI. And in this presentation, I'm going to try and rebalance that, if that makes sense. So I guess where I wanted to start with is I've put there the comfort of the screen. And I think for me, much of this comes from perhaps lockdown, COVID-19, where, we had to swap face to face for the screen. And that became the sort of dominant communications form and the way of sharing information, of sharing data. And there's quite a lot of comfort in looking at stuff on screens, particularly, dashboards. They are relatively easy to share. If you've ever had to present a dashboard yourself, they sometimes look quite impressive. Being on the other side of receiving certain dashboards, I sometimes wonder, they're a bit hard to interpret. They're a bit hard to poke and say, I'm not sure about that, and what does this mean? If I were being critical, I think they tend to measure what's quite easy data to capture. They assume that things are very much in a perfect world, and they ignore certain workarounds that you might do in your role or the organization might do in the way that it captures information. And I think the danger with that is sometimes we end up optimizing the wrong thing. The data presented is the easy stuff, and there's sort of human heuristics involved in how we interpret stuff. And it can sometimes, not always, but end up making us focus on the wrong thing. So I think what's happened is, and again, very much my own opinion and observations, is we've got too comfy with looking at screens and looking at dashboards and thinking that they are a direct representation of the world. And as the phrase says, the map is not the territory. I sometimes wonder that we interpret stuff you see on the screen as gospel, and sometimes it's not. And I just want to put that into context. And what I did was I had a dig around, and I wanted to show a slide that shows this overall data usage that we have at the moment. So I'm going to have to explain a couple of these, because getting hold of a question like how much data do organizations and enterprises use is actually quite tricky. But over on the left, you've got this chart which basically shows a forecast of how much data in zettabytes, so it's obviously quite a lot, that we're using and we're predicted to use over time. And you can see that in the 2010s that was quite low, and then this huge exponential rise of collecting data that's happened probably since ironically 2019. Has that got anything to do with the pandemic? Perhaps, I'm not sure. I think the big point here is, if you think about what we're collecting, which is quite a lot, what are we actually using? What are organizations doing and using and utilizing and acting off the back of that data collection? And you can see the sources for where I got this information, but I think it's quite stark. Enterprise data unused, 68%. Enterprise data used, 32. So we're collecting a lot of stuff, which is fantastic, but we're not really doing much with it. And I think this is the problem. We've almost become, in my mind, a wee bit obsessed with data collection without a thought of what are we using it for? How does the organization act on it? How might the organization measure that data? But yes, I suppose if you were a data hosting company, you'd be really, really pleased about that stat. But I think from an organizational point of view, it clearly shows we're not doing much with it. So, all right, next button. So I want to try and bring it round to what I originally talked about. And in my world, I am a researcher, obviously. Let's categorize two types of research. Let's talk about, over on the left-hand side here, we've got primary research, which very much explains the present, which is, this is the evidence that you are gathering yourselves for your own decision in your own context, and you're doing it right now for your pressing needs for the roles that you're actually performing. Now, that could be quantitative data. It might be a survey you commission. It might be a poll that you're running either with colleagues or with customers or with stakeholders or whatever that is. It could be qualitative, which is interviews. It might be you're listening into sales calls. Maybe you're riding along with the teams and you're seeing how they interact with customers. Or maybe you're just sitting in the warehouse or the operations room and you're just watching how colleagues onboard new customers or how they process certain sales or orders or refunds or something like that, depending on what you do for your role. So you've got this primary research, which is pretty much serving your good self. Now, the secondary research is obviously desk research. That's anything someone else has collected for another purpose. Typical examples: reports, market sizing, analyst notes, existing data, competitor teardowns or reviews or dashboards. And I think the thing about those is, depending on the data lag in the capturing of them, they describe the past. So we've got these two types of data that you can use. Ideally, you'd have both, but I think at the moment there tends to be some favoritism to going towards secondary research, clearly because it's already there, it's already accessible. But what I would propose is that it's great, but it's not really collected for your sole purposes. So it often lacks a little bit of context and nuance for your own application. So if we just sort of level ourselves with, right, okay, these are the types of data, if you're running research, you would typically choose. It sits in those two camps. Now, another way to think about that is the what versus the why. And we've become very, very good at capturing the what. I think we've been less sophisticated as understanding why. So if I think about the what, those are numbers. So that's the quant data. So capturing how data is moving or how stuff is responding and changing. So it's showing the movement, but it's not giving you the motive. So it tells you what's happening, but it doesn't really tell you why. And that's important, I think, because most fixes, if you're going to use data or research to solve a problem, most fixes are interventions in behavior. They're interventions in how a customer does or doesn't reorder, does or doesn't respond to certain campaigns and stuff like that. So you really need to get the motive behind customers or stakeholders to understand how best to make an intervention that fixes the problem that you've identified. And so the example here I've just put just here, which is that if you think about the data you might already have, it might be drop-offs in a customer journey. It might be the churn, customers leaving you, exiting. It might be the delays that you're experiencing in fulfilling an order on operations or something like that. When you use qualitative research and primary research, the why gives you the frictions in those drop-offs. So where are the little banana skins that cause somebody to think, oh, do you know what? I'm fed up with this. I'm bored. I'm going to drop off. The why gives you perhaps the fears, that inert fear behind why someone has decided not to renew their contract or their business with you. Churn is churn, but actually the motive behind it may well be something to do with fear. It may be something to do with missing out. It might be to do with a very strong human emotion that quant data cannot identify. And then the delays in the what, so the delays in operationally, well, if you to look at the whys behind that, perhaps that's just some bad habits that teams or the organizations has tripped themselves into, and they've got themselves into a bit of a rut, and they don't quite know how to fix it. So understanding the why for me is a much, much better way of fixing what it is you're going to go in and do once you've identified the problem. And I think that's where the limitations of those two data types lie. Is yes, we can capture numbers until they come out of our ears, and that does show the movement and how things are changing, which is great. But it's very difficult to act on that because you're not getting the motives behind why. So those are the two things that I would propose you need to think about when you're looking at a set of data. Is yes, that's great, it's amazing. There's a bar chart or a dashboard or a pie chart, and it's giving you the what. But then the next question is, right, well, why is that happening and what are we going to do about it? I mentioned earlier, and this is sort of the summary of before I talked to you about, field research. The map isn't the territory. The map's an abstract. The map's a reduction of what's happening out there, and it's presented to you in a very neat, very bright and shiny dashboard, which looks fantastic and great. Often it's just not the reality. The reality is, because we're dealing with human beings here, the reality is that human behavior is less linear, less shiny, less clear cut than a dashboard would have you believe. So that's what I would say to you, is that, yes, think about the amazing presentation capabilities of dashboards, but then have a think about what's going on underneath that, what's happening on the field, what's happening in our customer call centers, what's happening in operations. That is often far from linear and clean. It tends to be a bit messy, a bit jumbled up. So getting an understanding and an acceptance that the map isn't the territory is a good place to put your head into when you're assessing an issue that you might be going into and you're looking at different data types to make some decisions. So I keep talking about going into the field. My goodness me, David Attenborough is the master of going into the field, sitting next to some huge, great big gorillas and understanding the behaviors. Imagine if he were to be doing the same thing, but he had a remote camera and just took some pictures every now and again. He wouldn't get the texture. He wouldn't understand the nuances of what's happening. And it's exactly the same in field research. It's ethnographic, really, in its origin. So when I talk about qualitative field research, I don't want to talk about it turning into a massive 6-month anthropological project where you study gorillas, because that's not really why we're here. This is in a business context. But the same thing is that in field research, you are studying people in the context where the behavior happens, not in the lab, not in secondhand data that's captured via a dashboard. It's in the moment where that behavior happens. And I think that's the big benefit when you do this type of work, when you go out into the field and you talk to customers and stakeholders and suppliers. It's about understanding and seeing the real environment with the real interruptions that happen when the internet goes down, when that delivery doesn't turn up, when the factory floods, or when the boss doesn't turn up when he says he's supposed to turn up. You get to understand the real stakes and the messy constraints of life. You know, the fact that someone might leave the meeting 20 minutes early, they have to go and pick their child up from nursery, something like that. All these different things are the bits that you get to understand when you go out into the field, which sounds obvious, but sometimes we forget about it and we believe that the reality is our bright, shiny dashboards that show us what's going on. And so what I guess I'm promoting, am I promoting it? I suppose I am. I'm saying, find a way of going out and understanding where the real behavior happens. Because I think two things will happen in my experience. Number one is you will look at something and go, oh my goodness me, I never realized that was happening. But there'll be other things where you think, okay, yeah, I noticed that, I recognize that. I've kind of seen that somewhere else. So there's a way of you validating what you see. So you get lots and lots of benefits when you go out into the field. So how do you do it then? So if you were going to do it, or you're going to try and get a member of the team to do it, and it doesn't have to be as looks a bit MI5 here, doesn't it, with this slide? But really, what you're doing is you're going where the work is, you're going where the action is, you're going where the customers are, where the problems might be. And what you're doing is you're watching, you're listening, and you're asking these questions, which is, show me how this works, or show me how you would do that. So you're getting people to perform the real tasks, understanding those real constraints. You're listening to the language that they use and how they refer to your products and services, because it will be very different to how you think they refer to it. And the big thing, workarounds. You think people will use your product or service in a very, very way that it was designed for, and sometimes it isn't. They'll do a workaround. They'll do something that you didn't think they were doing because something doesn't work for them. So they're having to perform a workaround. And once you find out what those are, It's a great way of fixing a product, and it might be something very, very, very simple. These are the types of things you can only really find when you go out into the field. The type of answers that you're getting are along the lines of, how did you choose that brand? Why did you choose us, and why not someone else? What would persuade you to do this, or how could we move you on to that, or what if we did this? Where did you hear about this? How did you know that we were doing this type of product rollout, etc., etc.? Who helped with the decision? So it's not just you. Who else do I need to understand is in that decision chain in the organization that is saying yes or no to this purchase? And then why is that important? So why does those little things that you do, or the things that we do, or the things we don't do, why are they important to you? And those are the types of answers you're going to get when you watch and listen and then ask someone to show you. So it doesn't need to be onerous, all this stuff. When I talk about field work, here's some very, very simple examples. A very, very light version of field work is a customer site visit, is walking around their business, having a look at who's involved, saying hello, understanding how your work, your product, your service fits into their organization. It's really very simple. Listening in on calls is another good one, or listening to any support tickets if you're in technology or software as a service, while watching screen recordings of how a customer is finding a problem using the interface or something along those lines. Riding along with sales guys or girls, that's a brilliant way of really understanding it. If you can do it, you'll get some real gold with that. Or, as I said before, sit with onboarding teams, seeing how they work with the customers, seeing what the customers are saying. And then the super easy one is conferences and events. If you're going somewhere where you know your customers are going to be, and I don't mean that you're following them around like something really sinister, but if you're watching how they interact and what they're saying, going to a conference and or an event is a great way of getting some insights from some of those people. So if you're trying to understand non-customers, people who aren't working with you, and this is something I do a lot, and the person in that picture who Gary knows is my colleague Adam, and we do a lot of this where we literally will make sure that we're targeting the right type of customer. In other words, someone who has a propensity to be a customer of the brand involved, and we'll just doorstep them. We'll knock on the door and ask them a few questions about, have you thought about this? How do you do this? Who do you use at the moment? Why do you use that? Yes, you get told to jog on a few times more than often, and the hit rate for us is normally knock on 6 doors, get 2 interviews. That works quite well. Or with non-customers, you can just have something on the screen like I've got there. Go up to them and say, can I just get your feedback for a minute? Can you just tell me what you think about this? It's a super, super quick way of getting some feedback on perhaps a new product development, or maybe you're changing your messaging or your proposition or your pricing. It's a really, really good way of doing is just getting some feedback. Yes, you do have to confront members of the public and explain what you're doing, but you will be rewarded for it, I promise. Just checking my time. So we're about nearly halfway through. So I put here, the context is the magic. So don't worry too much about the research method, because the magic is context with field research. The context is you're in your customer's world, you're in their environment, you're watching them consume your product or service in real time, and you're just listening. So the context gives you the magic. It gives you a view of what your customers are thinking, feeling, and doing. The context reveals the problems you wouldn't think to ask about, because you can see how people are using stuff. You can then prompt them and say, just run that past me again. Why did you just do that? Can you just help me understand that? The context reveals what the product is really used for, not necessarily what the specification says, but why the customer uses it. A good example is, I need to be careful what I say about this, but having worked recently with some high-end chief technology and chief information officers around data security, when you talk to these types of people, yes, the product has a transactional role in protecting data in the organization, but actually the real emotional job, and I heard this verbatim, was making sure that the CTO and the CIO hang on to their jobs, because if there's a data leak, it's their head on the line. So the reason for the product is far more emotional and it's got more jeopardy to it than just making a piece of data secure. It's preserving someone's job. And when you go out into the field, those are the types of things you understand. What's the real motivation why someone purchases this product or service from them? And as I've said, the context reveals the workaround around how your product or service is used. And it might be that the workaround that they're doing at the moment, and it might be they're not using the product or service in the way you thought they were, is really holding the business together. And if the workaround were to not happen, it would have a catastrophic effect on how the business performs. So that's what the field work gives you. It's giving you the context. It's not the shiny dashboard pictures, it's the context that really gives you the value. So when I was putting this slide together, folks, I was trying to imagine some of the situations where you might be brought in as interim professionals. In other words, in the table on the left-hand column, the decisions that you're hired to make, it might be that you're trying to understand pricing. Have you been brought in to look at pricing, or some commercial side of the business that you've been brought in to look at? Well, field work can surface things like the hesitation triggers, the fairness lines around whether or not they think it's good value for money or not good value for money, the comparison set in terms of how they're comparing your product or service versus someone else. If it's around something like positioning, brand or market positioning, field work can give you the jobs to be done language. So the real reason someone hire your product or service to do a job. It might also show you the rejected narratives. In other words, I'm not interested in that sales message. It doesn't work. That story doesn't fit with me. It's something else. When it comes to onboarding new customers or users into the service, fieldwork gives you the drop-off points, the confidence drop-off points where someone goes, I'm just not sure about that yet, not quite ready to commit. It also shows you the bits where they go, I'm just going to think about that for a bit. I'll close the session now and then I'll come back to it in maybe, I don't know, a day or a week. And then again, the workaround behaviors, what do they do to get around certain, perhaps, email verifications that you have to do when you're onboarding, the workarounds that they perform in order to do that. If you've been brought in to look at customer churn, there's world changes that field work could surface. In other words, what's happening out there that might have an effect on why someone has decided not to renew with me. What are the broken promises that you said you'd do but didn't or weren't fulfilled that made them think, I didn't really get what I needed here. I'm going to think again. And then you're going to get the replacement choices, which is, right, who are people thinking of going to, or who have people already migrated over to? If you've got friction in the sales process, fieldwork can show you where those slow points are in the deal and what they might be. They might uncover the stakeholder fears. What are their other colleagues thinking and feeling? And proof threshold. So depending on the price point, how much proof, how many case studies, how many testimonials do they have to provide or do you have to provide to them in order for them to say yes? What are the thresholds that they need to then go and sell your idea onto other colleagues to release the budget or the purchase order? And then operational workflow. So you've got hotspots where there's an exception to how your workflow is going through the business. Perhaps there's failures in where you hand off to third parties or other departments. Perhaps there's a little break in what's happening there that needs to be identified. And it shows what are the coping routines. So what is the business having to do as a result of there being an ops workflow issue? So I think field work with carefully crafted questions and questioning can help you unlock some of those problems you're looking to solve. So I thought it might be easier for me just to give you a quick field case study. And if you look in the center of that picture, there's a very dodgy looking person who looks suspiciously like me, and it is me. And so this is a piece of work that I did a few months ago for a business to business energy supplier. And we were looking to speak to shops, really, micro businesses, shops, kebab shops, vape shops, nail bars, phone shops, florists, key cutters, all the independent shops you might see in your local high street. And we spent 3 or 4 days literally knocking on doors. And as I say, if we knocked on 6 shop doors, 1 or 2 would say yay. At least one of them might say, come back, I'm a bit busy at the moment. But that in itself was a great insight that we could report back to our client who sold business energy utilities to these people, which is that they couldn't understand why they weren't answering their calls at certain times of the day. Well, if you're a nail bar person, or if you're a coffee shop, you well know there are peaks and troughs in when an owner is got an ability to answer the call because they're dealing with a customer. So how shops behave on a daily basis was one of the main things we had to report back to their outbound telephone call sales agents, which was you need to call them at a time that's right for them, or perhaps don't call them at all. Maybe the better way is WhatsApp. And that's one of the other things that we found. So we spent a long time going in, talking to lots and lots of people. This was in Birmingham. There was a test brand campaign running there at the same time. So we were able to test a little bit of feedback on that as well. And then what I wanted to show you is what happens once we collect some of this qualitative data. Once you've got some transcripts from people, or you've got some comments, or you've recorded a call, what happens top left is you generally clean all of the data that you've got, making sure that any copy and paste is removed. You then go in and then analyze every single transcript, every single line of conversation. And then we do what we call coding, which is you summarize everything that was said. So it gives you an understanding of what the most popular themes were in a certain conversation. And then what you can do, top right, if you can see, this is a network map. And you can see how some of what you hear from customers begins to link to each other. You can start making certain relationships between, one subject and another subject. And you can see there, you've got, this is around business enhancement and ROI. So it just shows you how certain nuanced themes start to work together. So people often think with qualitative data, no, you're not looking at statistical significance and pie charts and everything else, but there is some quite rigor to it. And generally speaking, in number 4 down here, you condense all of those codes, everything that I've just shown you here, into a set of themes. So you go from the raw qualitative data, you code it, and then you get themes. And themes are the big things that you then can report back to people and say, look, one of the big themes here is that there's a massive price promise problem, or there's a big problem with returns, or customers feel like they're going to get a better deal if they switch in 6 months rather than 6 weeks. So the themes are the ones that give you the bit you can report back to stakeholders and say, when it comes to this issue, these are the dominant themes that people are thinking, feeling, and doing. And just as a bit of an example, after the work that I showed you when we went into Birmingham, we constructed some personas, and we divided who we spoke to into 3 different types of personas. We had, when it comes to switching energy, we had what we call effort averters and stay putters. And that was because what we were hearing was that, do you know what, it's just not worth me switching. 120 quid is not even worth it. Don't bother. I'll just stay where I am. And then here you've got what we called them Pandora's box keepers, because when they're switching business energy, it was so painful. They wanted to do it once and then lock it away and never have to do it again until the contract had expired 3 or 4 years down the line. So Pandora's box keepers we talked about were those people. And then you had problem solvers. These are people who, when we asked them, they said, well, I got caught out by small print in the past. I tried to make a claim on when the shop got broken into and they wouldn't pay out. They do feel slightly overcharged and underserved, but they're quite creative and they like to overcome complexities. So they are open to consider a switch. And so when it comes to motivation to consider switching, don't really bother with effort averters and stay putters. Focus instead on these problem solvers on the right. So we were able to help the client with new propositions, new segmentation, reprioritize ad spend, and new call scripts for the outbound call agents. So I wanted to show this is the output. This is the output from the qual. I mean, there were lots of others, but one of those was this, and this had a huge effect on focusing spend and effort into the client's business. And so what I thought I would do is sort of kind of nearly finish up with what I called a 48-hour field sprint. So if you were interested in anything that I've spoken about, amazing if you did, by the way, thank you. If you wanted to give it a go, this is how I think you might approach it. Or if you had a colleague or another member of the team, you thought, yes, well, they might be able to run this for us, then this is sort of the mini playbook for it. And so what you need, I call it a clutch of Amazon vouchers, because depending on who your customers are, and let's assume for this example, they are in the business to consumer space or direct consumer, you need some way of incentivizing someone to talk to you. Come and talk to us for 15 minutes. I'll give you, 10 quid Amazon voucher. Is always a good way to incentivize. Yes, there is a bias in there, but you need something. You'll need some type of invitation to participate, some copy for that. You'll probably need a consent form, so you make sure you tell them why you're collecting the data and what you'll do with it. If you're going to do it remotely, Microsoft Teams or video call is just as good as anything else. You can use Gemini or chat to analyze the recordings. And yes, you're going to need a bunch of customers or prospects. So think about this as you trying to get a small sample of people who are going to demonstrate a high signal, so they can give you something that you can go away and go, I can report this back to my colleagues. So on day one, let's pick one decision you're going to test or you're going to ask about. You're going to recruit some people. They might be recent joiners, there might be churners, one-loss deals, frontline staff, support agents. You're going to recruit them, ask them if they'll come and talk to you. Try and get yourself 6 to 8 short conversations, 15 to 20 minutes, 2 to 3 observations. So listening, watching, sitting with them, what they're doing, how they're handling this, real kind of real study in observing people. And then on day 2, you're going to make it decision ready. So you're going to the synthesis is going to be in plain language. So you're going to talk about top frictions. Here's what they really struggle with. Here's how they're dealing with that struggle in a workaround. Here's what they keep saying. Look out for repeated phrases. Those are the dead giveaways. They keep saying this. I keep hearing this word. And a bit where the confidence drops off. That's what you're trying to capture, in a Word doc. And the output might be what I've called a one-page decision memo, like what's happening with this customer type, with this product or service, and why is it happening? And then 3 options of what you might do next week to fix that. If you need a bit more certainty and you really get to grips with it and you enjoy it and you've got a little bit of oomph behind you, or your colleagues, maybe extend to 2 weeks, maybe expand the segments, maybe go for a higher confidence level in what you're hearing. The bonus things, if you can capture them, are 30-second clips of either recording or a video of them talking, because seeing is believing. Report back to your colleagues and say, here's exactly what these people are thinking about that, and then play the video, and it has a remarkable effect. You say to stakeholders, right, if you don't believe this big report, watch this. So that was my kind of, if you were up for it and into it, or knew someone who wanted to do it, this is briefly how you might give it a whirl, and just try it and see how you go. I think in terms of what good looks like, you want that one striking moment that captures the problem in context. It might be the cue, it might be the interruption, it might be the confusion or the workaround. And these are little bits of evidence that can help change decisions. Or 3 recurring patterns. If you see them, the same thing happening 3 times, then you're probably onto something. That's a pattern of behavior you need to report. And those customer phrases, think about, 5 phrases they repeat in their own language, and you can feed those into your messaging. Maybe they're part of your Google AdWords, or maybe they're part of your SEO or their sales enablement. You can put them on leaflets or their onboarding or product labels, but listen to how people are talking about your product and use that. And that's hopefully gives you a picture of what good might look like. I think that's about it, folks. I don't want to talk too much at you, but I think that just might give us some time if you wanted to answer questions or any further thoughts. Gary, shall I hand back to you?
Yeah, just looking at the group, the conversation, mindful that I didn't have the chat settings set up correctly. That didn't help. But when I did, Mike kindly raised a comment, and it's very much something that's very close to my heart, which is the management by walking about, as I used to do it. So back in my voice management days of running call centers, I'd walk around and just chat to people to your point, which is ongoing insights and ongoing research, is to pick up actually, as Mike said, kind of lifting the lid on what's actually happening on the floor. So the insights you pick up with just what are we being asked to do, how are we being asked, how are you responding, any themes today, and it was at that stage a number of years ago, but a very good reflection of what's going on in society today. So even where we've had, God forbid, national disasters around the country, just being in a call center where the state of the nation is reflected in the call center behaviors and what's getting called in and what's getting asked for. So as you said, it's kind of interesting. I think there's also a comment from Amanda, who talked about what proportion were there in the 3 personas. So as you talked about the outcomes, but almost that right-hand column of the ones you want to act upon, the ones where there probably is an addressable market rather than the other 2, what kind of percentage splits were there across the 3?
It's a good question. I don't have a stat for that. I mean, this is very much qualitative. So I believe the next step after that would be to do as you exactly describe, Amanda, which is maybe run a quant survey, like to what extent and at what size, are these representative within the market? I mean, we didn't get that information from that study because it was qual only, but it would have been handed back to, and that's very much the client's remit there, which is to work out what's the split here. All I do know is that the PPC budget got chopped up quite substantially. I don't know by how much, but they're after that particular piece of insight. So that's all I can offer on that one, but very good point.
And a bit from Shay, who talked about, I think you mentioned this really about recording the videos and answering them brief live. And I liked in Shay's kind of comment to something I did many years ago. I used to stand over people. So back in the days pre-complex clickstream analysis, you'd be standing over the shoulders to say, just can you show me what you did then?
Yeah.
And why aren't you clicking on that? And why aren't you clicking on that? So it's, as kind of Shay's alluding to, is recording stuff to watch them and just understand their decision-making process, and without asking them, because I think it's, you probably know better than me, that I think it's the Hawthorne effect, which is by the nature of something being observed, the nature of the action changes itself. So by sending back and not necessarily telling people what you're watching and what you're doing, you get a pretty good insight, and you pick up some thoughts about the process they're going through to make the decisions they are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are some products out there, user testing, look back, which is one that we use, which enable you to do, Jay, unmoderated testing. So you're not on the call. It records the call for you. And what you do is you set a bunch of instructions, log in, navigate here, download that, and you encourage the participant to talk aloud. We call them talk aloud. So you encourage them to say, well, I'm trying to find this. I can't find it. Oh, this is a nightmare. Why did I click that? And talk alouds are quite a good way of getting that, but you have to have the right, this sounds wrong, but it shouldn't be. You have to have the right type of person who's happy to talk aloud, what they're thinking and doing and saying while they're in action. But I've always found unmoderated sessions, you're right, Gary, about being asked and being under pressure. It sometimes makes people do funny things. But a recorded unmoderated session is them in their own time with no one else on the call. You sometimes get a bit more reality with that.
Probably one last question before we wrap up for me, which is always, always the one thing that changed your life. What in recent assignments or recent projects you've been involved in, what's the one thing that kind of leaped out in terms of an insight that the customer or your client really didn't get, and they're like, "Wow, oh my God, you just blown my mind." What was it that really shifted that perception?
Yeah, it's a good question. The one that sticks out is we did some website user testing with young drivers here in the UK on behalf of a big UK car insurer. And they were launching the black box product, telematics thing. So, and they couldn't understand why the user, the young drivers were, dropping off. They weren't going through and completing the forms. And of course, you only have to run a usability test with a young person who's not used to driving, who has never insured their car in a life, to see they're completely bewildered. And the one place where they kept tripping up was, that question, folks, if you've ever had to renew your car insurance, it will say, what annual mileage do you want to do? 5,000, for business and leisure. And another question, it says, what's the mileage on your vehicle? They kept getting those two things mixed up. And so what was happening is it was generating a massive quote. They bought a clapped out micro with 50,000 miles in, and they put that in their annual mileage. And then it said, oh, your quote is £7,000 a year. And so because they'd never done it before, they were completely bewildered by the labels, completely intimidated by the amount of questions. And every time we tested it with them, I got halfway through and they said, we just don't know what we're doing here. And so the fix was, just before the session started, a pop-up just said, look, we're going to ask you lots of questions you're probably not familiar with. This is going to take about 10 minutes. Go and have a cup of tea. If you get overwhelmed at any moment, save the quote button here. And that pop-up I don't want to quote too many figures, but it helped write at least £250,000 worth of more insurance premiums just by doing that little thing, by accepting that the business had treated every single individual as exactly the same. Oh, you've done it before, you know what you're doing. And it's just about understanding customers. When you're 16, you don't know, I mean this respectfully, you don't know anything about cars, let alone car insurance. And that was the bit that really stuck with me. And when I went back and reported it, we all did the hand plant. I can't believe we did that. It's just something we completely, overlooked.
I'll wrap up. Even though you're predominantly talking, I'll wrap up with an extra story. That's just you got me thinking about something that I've run into, and I'll give you a number because it's stuck in my head. Which was, I worked for a very large classified advertising brand a number of years ago, and we did a very similar exercise to what you did, which was if people were stalling and not completing an online process, we would literally ring them up and find out why they were not doing it. And it's for a multitude of different reasons. But I remember it netted £186,000 in 3 months.
Wow.
A lot of money, because literally you were ringing up and said, I'll tell you what, I can close that thing for you, or I can complete that process for you. Would you like me to do that for you? Yes. £186,000 in 3 months. For that very reason, it's like, rather than just let it go, so it's a shopping basket, shopping basket insight. But actually, people, for whatever reason, they just didn't complete the transaction.
Yeah.
Do you want me to do it for you? Yeah, because all they had is agents that could see the scene screen literally where they got to.
Yeah,
I'll do it for you. £186,000. Thank you very much.
Brilliant.
Easy thing. But as you said, it's all about the questions you ask and the curiosity that you continue with to keep digging to understand where the bottlenecks are and what you're going to do about it, which is, as you said quite rightly a number of times, it's all well and good coming up with research, but it needs to be actionable research.
What we're going to do
have
with
an
it.
outcome, and hopefully you can take action on that and make a difference. Right.
Yes.
I don't think there's any more questions. And also, knowing George as I do, I know he needs to get away early. So 5 minutes before the hour, George, is that enough time?
Yep, that's great. Yeah, no, all done.
Thank you very much. A recording has been done of the call. We will likely get that recording out to the people that ask for it, and George has already kindly agreed to share that the presentation content with everybody. If there's any questions from me, the IIM, or George, once again, we can pass contact details on, and we can pass the nature of the inquiry backwards and forwards. Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Yeah, not at all. Thanks for listening, folks. Good to see you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Indeed, sir.